person I was playing when you were walking in, I'm sure you're familiar with, it's Michael McDonald. And I was doing a tour for a while with Toto, and we were co-headlining with Michael McDonald. And so every night it would be our band would open the show, and then the next night Michael's band would open, and we were flipping back and forth on the road. And eventually it didn't work out with Michael's engineer, his sound engineer. So Michael asked me to mix both shows, which doesn't sound like it's a big deal, just sitting there and pushing up some faders for a few hours. But the reality is that there's 2 entire bands to set up every day. There's changeovers. Michael likes to do a 3-hour sound check every day so he can warm up his voice. But definitely one of the nicest individuals I think I've ever worked with in the music business. He is just a sweetheart guy. And I came in and I did this tour, and the tour lasted for, I don't know, not even a month, something like that. And we ended down south somewhere, and I had gone and had dinner with the band on my last night there and was talking to them. They're all just really nice people. And so I'm packing up my stuff, and I said my goodbyes at dinner until we did our show, and I'm packing up my stuff, and I get this call on the radio. Ken, don't go anywhere. Don't go anywhere. And I said, okay, what's going on? I'm just packing up my gear. I said, just stay there. And then I see, and Michael comes from backstage, and he's running, and he jumps off the front of the stage and comes out and gives me a big bear hug and thanks me for my work. And great person, very humble, just has zero attitude. You know, we were in some of these places, and he would be walking down the outside malls by himself, you know, and people, the moms would come up and recognize him, and they'd get all excited, and, you know, but he just completely humble, sweetheart person. I hope I get to work with him again. I talk to him fairly often, just texting back and forth on Facebook and stuff like that. But I just wanted to play a little bit of his music because I was thinking about what a great tour that was and how much fun it was. So that's Michael McDonald. So we're going to start with our little our drum thing here. And I edited this stuff very quickly, and so they're just kind of chopped up into little bits, and so I'll kind of talk us through all of them and show you what I got for you. So the first one is the control room at Eric's studio. And so you walk up the stairs, and the studio part's downstairs, so you can load in and out easy. And then you come upstairs into the control room. And this is his Neve room here. And there's some sporadic talking on here. Let's see, I think it comes in here pretty soon. This is Eric's Neve room. And this is all the outboard gear, some beautiful outboard gear he has here. These are all different compressors and EQs mainly, and a few reverb units. Then here's the patch bay over here, like we saw in the other studios, the backbone of the studio. Here's the patch bay. I just said that. This is the Neve console, and there's a lot of little tiny knobs and buttons on this baby. And every button does about 5 or 6 different things. So you hit it once and it turns one color. You hit it again and it turns another color. And it's pretty complex. If you look down these channel strips. Yeah, so this is all the mic pre-section here. And then we have your compressor and EQ, which are analog, but they're controlled by a computer here. And these are your aux sends. Use these for either headphone mixes or for effects. This is your direct out. That sends a level to Pro Tools. And this is your monitor section, pan. These select the different channels on the computer, this select button. And you got a solo and a cut, or a mute. And then you have the faders here too. And these are for automation, and they also have a solo and a cut that you can automate. Sorry, I'm huffing and puffing. I've been running up and down the stairs the whole time. That's the one thing about having the studio on the first floor is you're constantly going up and down. And then this is the center section of the console. And this is where you do all the controls for automation, for speaker selection, for input selection. You have reverb returns over here. And you have buses, just like we have in Pro Tools. You have 8 buses on this console. And all the routing is done on this computer over on the side. So it's an analog console, but it's digitally controlled. I'm going to stop for just a second. It has, besides digitally controlled, it has a thing called Total Recall, where it remembers where every knob and every button is set on the console. And then it will give you a little screen, like a picture of a channel strip. And it'll say, oh, this knob is here and it needs to be here. And then you just turn the knob until it disappears. As soon as it finds exactly the right location, the computer knows, oh, you were at this spot before. So you can totally recall all of your mixes or your tracking sessions or whatever you like. It's pretty hip. It's a pretty hip setup. And the way that the digital controlled analog effects work is it looks like it's a plugin, so you have an EQ and you have a compressor and it looks just like a plugin, but it's really just a front end controlling analog circuitry on the desk. So it's a total analog circuit path and it's got a big, fat, beautiful sound. I love this console so much. And then now we're going to look at some effects here. Go look at the equipment over here. These are very famous compressors, and they're called distressors. And we're going to talk about these some in class. I have a software version of these. It's actually very nice. And then below that, these are URI 1176 compressors. Then above that, we have some DBX 165s. It's an over easy compressor. And then we have some DBX 160 VUs. And these are beautiful compressors. And I have software versions of these too that I can show you. And above that, we have our SSL EQ. This top unit is a Manley Vari-Mu compressor. Wonderful compressor. I love this. I use this for live sound also. It's always on my stereo bus. Next is a Sony S777, which is a very old school reverb. We have another Manley compressor here, ELOP. Some Millennium mic pre's. These are APIs, EQs. And then we have some 610s on the bottom. So these are all really audiophile pieces of analog gear. And this gear, I have emulations of most of it from a very good software company called Universal Audio. And Universal Audio makes the absolute best analog emulation, so I can share some of these plugins with you at some time. You won't have them in your Pro Tools system, but I would like for you to get familiar with them because these type of compressors are very unique and they're very individual. And I think that it's important to at least know what they are because they're in almost every studio. So let's take a look at what's inside our bass drum. First of all, there is no head on the front of this bass drum. Eric doesn't like a front head. And there's 3 microphones inside. There's a big packing blanket to absorb some of the bouncy ring sound. And there is a speaker. This is the sub kick, which is just a speaker wired with an XLR cable. And you plug it in, and any dynamic speaker can be a microphone too. This next mic is a FET 47, and it looks like this. And this is a classic bass drum microphone. And then inside, we have this mic, which is a Beta 52. It's made by Shure. And it's pointed not exactly at the beater. It's pointed a little bit to the side right now. And it's about a hand's distance away, probably 6 or 7 inches. Pretty much not quite halfway back. If you want more clicky sound, you can point towards the beater right there. But this is kind of a nice compromise position. So now we're going to listen to the bass drum. So this bench that I had in front of the bass drum, that piano bench, what we do with bass drums is we want to keep the sound of the other drums out of the bass drum as much as possible. So we'll take and we'll drape a heavy packing blanket across the front. And we use that stool to hold the blanket so that it doesn't fall on the microphones. And it makes like a tunnel. And this tunnel has about, a couple of feet of open space for the bass drum, for the sound to move inside there. And then it keeps all the tom-toms from coming in from above and all the cymbals from getting in the kick drum mics, so you can have your kick drum very isolated. And what I did was because I'm not much of a drummer, I'm about as good on drums as I am on keyboards, but I do know a couple of things about them. So what I did was I had Eric just play all of the different mics and different techniques, so you could hear about them. The other thing that happens is he didn't have a hole on the front of his kick drum, and he didn't have a front head. It's a studio recording technique, but most of the time, at least for live sound, you have some kind of front head, and it adds some resonance and some low end to the bass drum. And when you're miking a bass drum that does have a front head, if possible, you want to have a hole cut in the front head for the microphone to go in. And it does two things. First, it gives you a place to put the mic so you can get the attack of the beater inside. But it also lets the air come out of the kick drum, so it makes a poof type of sound. And that's how you can get a lot of nice low end. Some drummers do that, some don't. Simon Phillips, I don't believe, ever had a hole in his head. I can't remember. Maybe he did. But it's always an argument because they don't want to mess up the artwork on the front of the drum head, So, no, I can't cut a hole. It's got a beautiful, hand-sketched whatever on it. And I'm like, yeah, but you want it to sound good, right? So here's Eric playing a little bit of kick drum here. So these are the 3 different microphones soloed. That's that dynamic, that big Shure. And this is the Fett Neumann. And that's what that speaker sounds like when you use a speaker for a microphone. It's only subsonics. And that's all 3 mics combined and blended together. Okay, so let's talk about the snare drum. So my normal position for the snare drum is about right here. And it's close to lining up with the rim of the drum. And it's just a couple of fingers away. And it's pointed at the center of the drum head where he hits the stick. This is what that sounds like. So another technique is to come down more at the drum, like this. And so that's going to give you more of the rim sound, and it'll give you more ring out of the drum. So here it is. Another thing to think about when you're positioning your snare mic is your hi-hat, because the hi-hat is right next to the snare. And you can see that this snare, this hi-hat, is going to come right into that snare mic. So there's a trick that you can use the cardioidness of your microphone. And if you kind of come in from underneath the hi-hat, you can make the mic more off-axis, and so you'll have less snare or less hi-hat bleeding into the snare. So that's another technique you can use. Let's take a look at the bottom mic. So here's my bottom snare mic. And my bottom mic is basically pointed right at the snares, at the same distance, maybe 2 to 3 fingers away. But this mic, I'm going to have to reverse the polarity because it's underneath the snare. So kind of the way it works is when you hit the snare on the top, the air pressure and the snare is moving down first because you're hitting it. It's moving down. So, but from the bottom, when you hit the top, this head moves down first, so it's moving towards the microphone. This one, when you hit it, it's moving away from the microphone. It's going down. Under here, when you hit it, it's coming towards the microphone. So those two microphones have a naturally reversed polarity. And so you need to reverse the polarity on the bottom mic. So I didn't talk about, I didn't get a chance to mic up with condenser microphones also, but condenser microphones also can be a really nice choice for snare drum. As a matter of fact, some people, there's a technique where you put a condenser microphone, and if you have the shell of the bass drum, you actually, instead of pointing it at the head, you point it at the shell, kind of sideways at the shell, and it gives you this kind of unusual sound. A lot of people use that as an alternate microphone. And then other thing people will do is they'll take a pencil condenser and they will tape it to their main microphone so the capsules are exactly lined up together. The condenser has a different type of attack than the dynamic does. It's got a faster attack, and so it's got a different sound, but you can take those two microphones and you can blend them together and come up with some really nice, unusual snare drums. Snare miking, it's different for every snare drum too. So sometimes if you have a piccolo snare that's really bright and ringy, then you don't want to emphasize the rim. And sometimes if you have a big fat snare, the really, ballad type of big fat snare, then you want to really get in there and get close to where the stick is attacking. And so it's always a game of playing with positioning. But the bottom microphone stays pretty consistent. You're going to want to point it right at the snares, and you're going to want to usually flip the polarity unless it's some weird distance that the polarity doesn't need to be flipped. So this is just the snare top. And you can hear the bottom. So that's all you get from the bottom is that rattle. But when you combine them, it makes a nice... So you can hear both the attack and the rattle. So for the hi-hat, we can position mics in a lot of different ways. So some people like the hi-hat way back here, as far away from the snare as possible. And that sounds like this. As you start moving the microphone closer to the bell, you'll get more of the harmonics out of the cymbal. So we'll just move this mic around while I'm playing it, and you can hear the difference. So that's pretty much the outside edge. You don't want to come all the way to the edge because you'll start getting these kind of puffs of air sound. I'm going to be kind of more in this area. And because this mic is a condenser and it's a cardioid microphone, the closer you get, the boomier. So if you get your mic too close, your hi-hat's going to sound real woofy like this. And especially if you're that close and you come to the outer edge, then it gets really gnarly sounding. Now, some people also mic their hi-hats from the underneath, mainly for aesthetics, and or if there's a lot of other instruments in this area, sometimes they'll mic it from underneath. So you notice that whenever I mic any instrument, I'm always moving the microphone around, and I'm always looking for a sweet spot. And that's true with any instrument that you put a mic, because a mic is our ear, right? It's what we're going to be recording through, and it's exactly what we're going to be hearing. So if you listen first with your ears, and then you listen in the headphones, and you move the microphone, you can usually find a sweet spot. And if you know a few basics about miking, which is proximity effect, the closer you get, the more bass you're going to have. So if you want a big fat snare drum, you can lay that microphone real close to the snare drum and get a big fat bassy sound. If you want a brighter kind of more concert or classical type of snare drum, you don't want to mic so close. You want to pull it back and get some more air on it. But all of these instruments have the same type of technique for finding mic position. So let's take a look at our toms. So the tom miking works basically the same as the snare drum miking. If you have a tom and you angle the mic towards the center of the head, then you're going to get more of that sticky type of stick type of attack sound. And if you angle it more down like this, you'll get more of a rim sound. So let's take a listen to those real quick. Here's across the head. There's not a lot of ring on this drum. And then here is more down at the rim. And this is a dynamic cardioid microphone. So the closer you get, the more bottom you're going to get. Further away, the more air. So that's an example of too close. And that's probably a little too far. So I'm going to go over to this other tom, and I'm just going to take the mic off the stand, and I'm going to move the mic around and let you hear a different positioning. So here's kind of a normal tom miking. Here's more down. Here's close. Here's far. And here is close to the center of the head. what I'm going to do now is I'm going to demonstrate 2 mics on the tom. So I'm just going to take this first tom mic and I'm going to flip it around so I can put it underneath this second tom. And then we're going to take a listen to how that sounds. I won't be able to get this positioned exactly right, but at least we can get the idea. So another thing, before we listen to this, another thing that you really want to be careful of when you're miking toms is you see how close this ride cymbal is right here? That's right next to the tom. So if you get your tom mic too much into that cymbal, you're going to get a lot of cymbal. And that's the reason a lot of times people will point down more into the tom also to get more of a rejection to that cymbal. You can also use condenser mics. Condenser mics are wonderful on toms, and I use them live all the time. I use this company, Earthworks, and they have some beautiful microphones. And condenser mics are great. The thing about a condenser is, like anything else with a condenser, the difference between a dynamic and a condenser, or one of the differences, is you want to be further away with a condenser because you can distort the capsule. Right. So with the dynamic, you're putting that mic really close, and then with a condenser, you know, I'm usually like, I don't know, 4 fingers away, something like that with a condenser. So I'll just take, if the mic is there and there's the drum head here and the mic's here, I'll stick 4 fingers in there and I'll angle the mic, and I can do that, and I'll get consistent distance by using my hand all the way around the drums and try to keep the condensers not quite as close as the dynamics. And then the other thing about condensers is they're brighter microphones usually, and they will pick up even more more cymbals. So let's continue on here with the double miking. So this is miking the toms top and bottom. And I will have to go back later and flip the polarity of that bottom mic, because right now it's just going to be out of phase. So that's bottom tom miking. And let's hear Eric. You notice the way Eric hits the drum. He comes in and out. He doesn't, well, he's a drummer. He plays much better than me, first of all. So that's all the toms with the room mics also. So right now, generally my ride position is right about in here, kind of aiming at this part of the cymbal. Here's what that sounds like. Here's pointed more directly at the bell. And I'm just going to move the microphone around a bit. You hear how as you get close to the edge of the cymbal, it gets very washy sounding and it loses its focus. And it can also, I didn't mention this in the video, but a thing that can happen is when you hit a cymbal, the cymbal moves like this, right? And if you have a microphone on the outside edge and you hit a cymbal and it rocks, it makes this weird type of sound. And so if you ever hear that on recordings, you'll know that they had the microphone too close to the edge of the cymbals. So that's one thing to be careful of. See how much that cymbal moves? And it's not wavering because I'm pointing the mic towards the center. Next, we have our overhead mics, and I have a couple of different things set up for you. Right now, we're listening to these beautiful AKG C12s, and this is way overkill for overhead mics. These are over 10 grand a piece, and they're beautiful sounding. They're great vocal mics. They're great on a lot of things. I love them on piano. Really, really nice, large diaphragm tube microphones. So let's hear what these sound like. And now my overheads are also picking up the drums. So this is kind of the distance from the drums that they are. So I have my camera sitting on the snare. So generally, what you want to do, there's two approaches for doing these spaced pair overheads like these. One approach is to measure the distance from the snare to this capsule, and then measure the distance from the snare to this capsule and make them equal. That way your snare image is right in the center. This type of miking is a spaced pair miking, and it's spaced very wide right now. And the reason it's wide is because it's mainly for cymbals. This is more of a pop type of setup. And it's for a jazzy type of music, you wouldn't necessarily do this. You could, I guess. But you would use more of this type of miking. This is our ORTF. So you notice the miking is very wide sounding. I mean, it's extreme. The panning is extreme. You can always pan it in. But for a rock kit or for a pop kit, a lot of times you want to keep the cymbals kind of out of the way of the snare drum and the bass drum because it's all about the groove. And so if you have these cymbals kind of off to the side, it gives you a nice wide stereo field. And it keeps them out of the way of the snare drum. So this miking is just the C12s, but he's playing the entire kit. So I've got the C12s soloed here just so you can hear what the cymbal mics sound like by themselves. And you can hear the snare is not really in the center of the image. But because they're just really kind of cymbal mics, it doesn't affect it that much because we have the the cymbal mic's so far away from the snare drum anyway. And that way we can have control of our snare with our snare mic. And this is that same miking with the entire drum kit in. You can hear the room mic in there also. I added the room mic this time, and that's that kind of reverby sound on the kick drum. And so one more. This is just the room mics. And these are some ribbon mics that are probably about 8 feet away from the bass drum. And they're spread out probably about as wide as the drum kit is, maybe 6 or 7 feet apart. This is ORTF. Yeah. So now this is our more jazzy type of overhead miking. You notice the snare is more in the center of the picture now. Not near as wide, even though that's a wide stereo miking. But jazz players will use this quite a bit for a big part of their sound, and they might use some bigger microphones, you know, larger diaphragm condensers to get a richer sound, or sometimes even ribbon microphones. And a lot of times, this will be the biggest part of their sound. And this is with the drums. Got a little too much room mic in there, sorry. Alrighty, next is our XY technique. And this is even more focused. It's not very wide at all compared to the spaced pair or the ORTF. Snare is pretty much right in the center of the image. Does a nice job of picking up the cymbals, though. It's just not as wide of a pickup pattern. So all of these overhead micings were mainly concentrating on the cymbal sound. Yeah, it's a little more even, that type of cymbal sound to me, when the crashes don't jump out as much, you know. Eric is quite a talented producer as well as a drummer. And he has this unique way of describing things that really get performances out of musicians. And so I wanted you guys to be able to experience this some. So I had him just tell us a couple of little stories. And the first one is the one that he uses to speak with vocalists a lot. So if he's got a singer that's going to sing, he'll tell them this story of how he wants their vocal to sound. And he calls it the Cool Ranch Dorito effect. So here we go. So Eric, tell them about the Cool Ranch Dorito thing.
Okay. So I have a saying where whenever I'm producing or playing that if you had just eaten some Cool Ranch Doritos, and you know how those smell. So if you just had Cool Ranch Doritos, the listener should be able to smell that on the track. So basically what I'm saying is that as clearly as you can speak as a musician or even recording, you want also, I believe you always want the listener to have it like this in your face. And there's certain things that we do as artists in whatever field that we're in to make sure that that effect comes across to the listener or even visually, but we're talking about the listener right now. So over time, when I would play, I always recorded myself. That's something really important. Everybody does it now, but you want to record yourself, you want to video yourself, and always just, take notes on the things that you do, and so that you can, work on them and improve them. So I would listen to my sound, and I would listen to other musicians that I was growing up listening to, and their sound was so clear when they played the instrument. It sounded like they were speaking a language, and I understood that they're speaking words. And, there's commas, there's exclamation points, markings, and things like that make music go up and down. So I kind of worked on that craft of understanding that whatever I want to say, I know how to get that said on the instrument. And so what happens is that, for example, these are exclamation. This is always an exclamation. Most of the time anyway. That's the exclamation. Most of the time, the steadiness in the hi-hat makes the groove settle. Having a part that that's consistent and even. These things help to make the listener hear things clearly. How you hit the drums, even the difference between hitting a drum and going. Like, I remember when I was younger and I would play and do fills and I would go and be like, man, and then hear somebody else go. I'm letting the drum sing. So these are things that I've worked on for that Cool Ranch Dorito effect.
So he does these big festivals. He does a lot of different type of music, but he does a lot of festivals where he will be the house band drummer, and he will have, 80 or 100 songs to learn for one concert, And so he's really, really good at figuring out how to do that. And he has an amazing system with his iPad, and the music director, actually, all the musicians these days do that. I'm sure you guys are familiar with it. But for me, it was amazing that everybody's got their big iPad there, and the music director just emails them charts. Every 10 minutes, they get a new chart, and he'll fix something in Sibelius, and he'll email the chart, and they're reading these charts off the iPad. And we were in here in my studio doing a mix on a project that we had done together. And Eric, in between working on the song, he was listening to the songs that he had to learn for the concert. And I was laughing because he listens at double time. He puts it on double time playback so he can learn the form of the songs quicker. And I said, anyway, it's just amazing. He has a real talent for learning songs and staying with it and being rock solid. Everybody loves it when they see him sitting behind the drums for a show. So I asked him to talk a little bit about that. Just talk about a little bit how you prepare and how you are able to work for an entire festival and know all of these songs for all these different artists.
Mm-hmm.
And what's your mindset that makes that happen?
Mindset is the most important thing. Before you even grab whatever your instrument is, it's mindset. And the question is, what do you want to achieve? Because if you don't know what you want to achieve, then you don't know how to get there. And so in your preparation, do you want to be the weakest link? There's things you do that you don't do, or to be the weakest link. Me, over the years, I've always wanted to be the person in the room that knew what was going on, not only just with drums, but around me, especially with this instrument, being that it's definitely like the foundation. You got to know what's going on. And so because my mindset is so in a place where I don't want to be the weakest link, my preparation is in a way where I try to know everything around me. So starting with humility, like hearing a drum part or hearing something in the music, saying, okay, I want to capture that first. Before I introduce who I am, Eric, understand where we're starting from. So I study the music in a way where a lot of times I'll get charts and I'll take the chart, and a lot of times I don't like to have a drum part. I like to just have like a master rhythm chart or something like that where I can see the bass part and see what the keys are doing. And I will handwrite all of my drum nuances into every chart. So what that does is it makes me know exactly what's going on, and it's also making it almost like memorizing. Because usually by the time I write something out, the song out, and the notes, I know the song pretty well. And then the chart, you will hear people sometimes say, "Hey, I don't want guys reading charts." For me, it's just I'm glancing like, okay, I confirmed that I know what's going on, rather than what is this part? Oh, my iPad died, or my paper fell on the floor and I don't know what to do. Yeah. So so as far as the mindset, just knowing what I want to accomplish with my I have my iPad and I write drum parts out. I look at accents and character, the character of what the musician is doing. And I'll also listen to the original materials, because a lot of times the artist, the client, will send you live, and that's fine and good. But I also go back and study the original material as well. And so I think before, it's not as technical as you might make it. It starts with the mindset. What do you want to achieve? And once you've gotten the idea of what you want to achieve, then you make a plan of how to get there. And then once you do that, you're going to be successful because you've worked it out. And so that's how I usually, study, music for, artists, and able to play a festival where I may be on, or play some of these other shows I might have over 100 songs or so to be prepared for, and just be open and humble.
So that's Eric. Great guy. Fantastic cat. I thought we would go back into our mixing that we started last week and I'm going to start off and just go back through a few of the things that were a little tricky. I'll go through them quickly just to refresh our memory. Right now, I have my Pro Tools session with all the faders down. And we started listening last week and we talked about groups. There it is. Okay, so we started talking about grouping and VCAs and how crucial and important and how much easier it can make your workflow. And so I'm just going to kind of go back through these groups a little bit and just re-talk about that. We had gotten through the groups last week and we had started analyzing some of the audio. And we had found some problems. So let's go back through and let's talk about our groups menu real quick here again. I had made a drum group, and I'll just delete these groups for right now. We'll remake them real quick. Okay, so we had already gone through and we had already color-coded our tracks, and I have all my drums at the top, and I'm able to see them easily because they're all the Same color here. So there's all my drums in blue. So talking about our grouping, I'm going to make a drum group, and I'm going to include in that drum group all of my drums. Usually when I'm working with drums, I make a bunch of different groups. I'll have a group that is my 2 or 3 kick drums in one group. I'll have a group that's my top and bottom snare drum is another group. And this is just so I can easily turn on that group, turn up the volume of a couple of instruments, and have them stay the same. I'll have all 3 of my tom-toms usually in the same group. And I'll have my overheads, if they're mono tracks, I'll have both overheads in the same group and that type of thing. And then I will also set up this master drum group, which is what we're going to do now. And I'll turn the master drum group off most of the time, and I'll just use that to be controlled by a VCA. So here's our drums. We're going to make a new group. I'm going to hit Command G to bring up the group dialog box. And if we look, we can see that we have these different types of groups here. We have an edit group and a mix group, and then we have our combination group. And that's what I'm going to select right now as our combination group. And you can see over in this column which instruments I have included in that group, right? So you can see I have my 2 kicks, my snare, my hat, my toms, and my overhead. These are stereo toms and stereo overheads, so that's the reason there's just one of each. And I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to click. I have Follow Globals selected. And we talked about globals. Globals are your settings that you want to use 9 times out of 10. And you just kind of leave these settings set, whatever your normal workflow is for your settings for plugins. You leave those set, and then you just have most of your groups follow this global set of parameters. So that's our global parameters. If you don't want to do that, if you want to do something special, you can click on this little attributes section, and you can turn off globals, and then you can do whatever you like. And you can link together anything you want. These are our inserts. So if you had a plugin across all those channels and you wanted all those plugins to behave exactly the same way, then you could pick an insert and you can link the controls of the insert. And so that would be like EQs or compressors or something like that. And then you can also link the bypasses of the insert. So if you bypass one, they're all going to bypass. And then on this side, we have all of our effect sends. So these are our aux sends, and you have 10 of each in Pro Tools. So there's 5, 10 inserts and 5, 10 aux sends. So that corresponds with these letters here. And you can pick what you want to group together. You can group together the volume of the master volumes of all the channels, and the master mute and the pans of all the channels. This LFE is low frequency. This is for it's a low frequency effect. It's for surround sound mixing, and that's when you have a separate send for the sub information. So this column here is our effect sends, and you can do the same thing. You can put effect sends on all of these drums, and you can link either the volume levels of the effect sends, the mutes of the effect sends, the pan of the effect sends, or the low frequency information. And down here, we have our mix attributes. And so this, you can link your solos or your automation mode. We haven't gotten into automation yet, but we will. You can link your record enable. This is really useful if you have a bunch of tracks. Like if you've got, sometimes when I'm recording a session, I'll have maybe 32 tracks that I want to put in record at one time. And so if you link the record enable, if you put one of those tracks in record, all of them go into record, and it makes it easy to switch. Down here, we didn't talk about this last week. Once you have a setting that you like, and I'll just click some random stuff here, right? Once you have this random setting here, you can save that setting. And you can do that just by clicking on Save down here and pick a location, and there's 6 different locations. So we'll save that to number 1. All right, save to number 1. And then let's do a different one. And you can save that to number 2. And then just by hitting these buttons down here, you can switch between your different configurations. And this is really useful if you have certain things you do all the time. For example, one of my presets might be none of these things enabled. Another one might be all of them enabled, So that's the little settings preset buttons down here. Also up here at the top, each group has an ID letter, right? So we have A through Z, and then we have 4 groups of A through Z, basically. So you can have that many groups. 108, is that what that comes out to? 26, yeah. So you can have that many groups in a Pro Tools session. And then this VCA is when we link a VCA to it. And we talked about that last week. But I generally link the VCA in this window down here in the tracks window. So let's go ahead and let's go back to I'm going to clear this out. I'm going to use follow globals, and we're going to make this a drum group. And I'm going to leave mix and edit so I can edit my drums as a group if I choose to. Click OK. Let's make our next group. Our next group is our percussion group, and there's only 3 elements here. So I'm going to Command G, and I'm going to make a new group. You see it automatically gave me the next ID down, the B ID down. So we'll call this percussion. I'm going to have it follow globals, and this is what my global settings are. You can see what the tracks are right here if you want to double check. And that's my percussion. Next, I have a couple of guitar tracks. I'll go ahead and group those. Command G. Brings up my dialog box, and it brings me to ID number C. And this is going to be guitars. Next, we have our piano, which is only one instrument, so we don't need to group it. We have 3 saxophones. I'm going to group those together. Command G. Group. And follow globals, and you can see the instruments there. And then we have a lead vocal, and we have a bunch of background vocals. So I'm just going to group these background vocals together. Group. Background vocals, and we'll make a group of all of those. Now, we talked last week also, if you made a mistake and you added too many instruments to the group, you can remove one. You can just select one and hit remove. And you can add it back in a couple of different ways, but you can scroll down and just find it. Background vocal 9, there it is, and you can add it back in. You also have replace and add down at the bottom that we talked about last week. So if I wanted to change the things that are in this group, I can just select whatever I want, and I can right-click on this group name here, and I can modify it. And I can say replace this. What was actually in it before, replace it with what I have selected now. And it just uses those. I'm not going to do that. I'm going to leave it the correct way. So that's kind of a little review of the groups window. The only other thing I didn't talk about is the difference between edit groups and mix groups. And edit groups mean that you're controlling the editing screen. So if I have all my drums in an edit group, all of these things are selected together. If I want to select my drums individually, I can just turn this off, and I can select individually. So that's what this highlight does around the groups. It turns them on and off. So I got my groups set up now. I want to assign VCAs to them. And so I'm going to come over here, and I'm going to just go to my VCA outputs here, right? You can see it in this window also. And I will assign my drums to my drum group. And I just made all these VCAs in my tracks list, and I just named them. And then all you had to do to assign it is just select it up here. Percussion, guitars. Now I can do the same thing. So for saxes, if I come over here and I modify my group with right click and modify, I can also change it here. So I can add the VCA up here. And it does exactly the same thing as adding it down there. So now I have my sax VCA. And the last one is background vocals. Boom. So I have all of my VCAs set up now. So the first thing you want to do when you're working with your VCAs is you want to put all your VCAs at 0 first. And I'm doing that by just option clicking on the fader. And that resets to default. Default for faders is 0. If you have an aux send, default is null or is nothing. So if I have this set here and I option click on this fader, oh, it does go to 0. That's an option actually. You can check, in preferences, you can set up whether you want your aux sends to go to 0 or go to null. So usually you want your aux sends to be set at 0 or at null, not at 0 when you click on them. Okay, so now we have our VCAs turned up, and you have to turn up these VCAs because let me show you what happens if you don't. If you leave them down and you start making a mix here, first of all, you're not going to hear anything. Well, yeah, you will because you're turning these up. But if you start making a mix and then you say, oh no, my VCA's all the way down, and you turn this up to 0, boom, it throws all your faders wide open. And so it'll get really loud really quick. So you want to start with your VCAs at 0. And boy, that can hurt some eardrums. You really want to be careful when you're working, especially with people with headphones, and try to work safely and quietly with audio any chance you get. I have one of my habits is that whenever I leave my console, I always turn my master volume down. I never leave it running. So if I had to go in and I went into another room and I adjusted the microphone, if I didn't have this volume knob all the way down and I unplugged a condenser microphone, it could make a big pop and it could blow up my speakers. And so always get in the habit of turning this down when you're not using it. Don't leave your volume set up high. All right, so that's VCAs. So let's just start listening to a little bit of drums here and see what we have. We went through yesterday or last week and we started fixing these a little bit. And what I'm going to do is I'm just going to turn these up. I'm going to option click on them and just put them at 0 for right now. And then if I don't want to hear so loud, I can take my drum VCA and I can turn it down some. And I'm going to disable all of these groups here. That disables the group for editing and for the mixing window, but it does not disable the VCA. So if I go back here and look at my VCA, it's still functioning. Right? So another safety thing with audio is when you play back something, you don't know how loud it's going to be. Turn it down first and then turn it up. That way you protect your hearing. So we already went through and fixed all this last week. So we had several problems. We had the bass drum was reverse polarity. So it doesn't have any low end. Hear the difference? So that's what polarity, having your polarity out of phase or reverse sounds like. And then we talked about also these tom mics, there's no toms in the entire song. But listen to the type of bleed that you get when you turn on the tom mics, even though there's nothing hit. Off. On. So this bleed can be either desirable or not. I tend to clean things up a lot. I like to use reverbs when I mix, and so I tend to clean up a lot of the toms. And if there's a tom track and there's a bunch of tom fills all the way through, I'll actually just if this was a so if this had tom fills in here, and let's say that maybe this is a tom fill here, I would actually separate that out. I would find all my tom fills and I would separate them. I would use my B key and then separate that. And maybe that's another tom fill there, B. And maybe there's a tom fill here, B. And maybe there was one somewhere else. We're just pretending like these are tom fills right now. B. So I have all of my tom fills separated. And what I can do is mute everything in between the toms. So I'm just hitting Command M. And you can get creative about how you have the toms ring and how it fades out. And you know, I'll get some drum tracks that have some more toms on them. So if this is our tom fill, we pretend like this is my tom fill here, right? So what I want to do is I'll go to my transient first, and I can turn on my tab to transient, little guy up here. And then I can just tab to this first transient, and I'll put a marker there, or I'll separate there. I'm sorry, not a marker. I'll hit B and separate the region there. And then I'll come and say, this is our last tom hit here, so I have boom, boom, boom. I'm going to want this tom to ring. I don't want to cut it off. So I'll find another transient, like maybe a transient, a beat later, and I'll mark there, or I'll separate there. And then I'll just mute all this stuff. And then all my tom track will be muted until this little fill comes in. And so in order to make this ring of the tom smooth, I'll put just a little fade out here. I'll hit my G key for my cross fade out. And that way I would have a doom, doom, doom with a sustain that's smooth. And that cleans up a lot of noise in your tracks. All right, so we're going to make a choice here. I'm going to say for this type of song, that tom ring isn't really helping me out, so I'm just going to turn this fader off. Or I can even go to this track, this tom track, and I can right-click on it, and I can make this whole track inactive. And it'll turn gray like this. And this is good for a lot of different reasons. One reason is you don't accidentally turn it on by mistake by unmuting it. Another reason is that you're releasing all of this plug-in power, whatever plugins you had on your toms. By bypassing the whole channel, you're releasing the plugin. If I didn't do that, make active. And let's say I had some plugins here, just whatever. Of course, I pick one that's hard to load. There it is. So if you wanted to bypass the plugin as opposed to bypassing the entire channel, you can just command click on it, and that bypasses it. And that's the same as hitting this little bypass button here on the plugin itself. But if you control command click on it, it totally deactivates it. And see, it turns gray like that. So that's active. That's totally deactivated. This is active, and this way is bypassed. So command click just bypasses it, and it turns that kind of bluish color. But when you hold down control command and you click on it, then it totally deactivates it and it turns gray, a light gray. And you do that because whenever you bypass a plug-in, you're still using the processing power. It's still there ready to go. But whenever you deactivate a plug-in, it's totally out of the system. So we'll just go ahead and go back and deactivate this track. And it's called Make Inactive. You right-click on it and make it inactive. All right. So let's take a listen here and let's hear the balance of our drums. So these overheads sound nice. This is a jazz type of miking, right? It's very full-bodied. It's got, it sounds like it's a left-right miking. It's not a ORTF or it's not an XY. Very wide miking, but it's got a lot of body to it. Sometimes that type of body in an overhead track can get in the way of lower frequency instruments. And so you can go in and you can EQ that and clean it up. So we haven't really talked much about EQing yet. So I want to open up our EQ, our Avid EQ. And it is called EQ3 7-band. Did we go over this plugin yet? I can't remember. Did we go over all the features of it? I don't remember. I don't think we did. We did talk about gain structure, and we did talk about, our input level and our output level and how they have to match. Right? So if we start adding volume to a specific frequency, it's going to increase our output level. And now you see that our output level is louder than our input level. And that's not good for proper gain staging. So what I would do if I did want to do this crazy EQ that I just did, which is not desirable at all, I'm bringing up a lot of mud in the mix basically. I would have to bring down my output knob to match. So my input and my output are basically the same level. Besides the metering here, which this is actually a really nice meter to use for a lot of things because Pro Tools doesn't really come with a great free meter plugin. I'm going to look online and see if I can find a free one that I can hip you guys to. It's nice to be able to see your volume level here, even your mic pre-level or whatever. It's a little easier to read than these little meters on the side here. You can blow these up really big, and make them look like that, and it's a little easier to read. But still, it's not as nice as having a proper meter where you've got the numbers on the side. So I'm going to get rid of this EQ. And I'm going to get rid of this EQ by the way I did it was just to option click on this knob, and it resets it to default. So option click is used all over the place. It's really a good thing to know. You also, on the EQ plugin, you have a polarity switch. So you don't have to put that trim plugin in and switch the polarity like we did with the bass drum last week. You can actually do it right on the EQ here. And then we have our two filters. So these filters are dual filters. They do two different things, each one of them. It's an either-or type of thing. But the first one is called a high-pass filter, and that's this little angled down looking symbol here. And what that does is when you activate it, it cuts out the low end. So it's a high pass filter. High pass filter means that you're letting the highs pass. And so you're cutting out low end in essence. And you can kind of think of all of these equalizers as frequency specific volume knobs. So if I were to take one of those dots, right now I'm working with my filter, right? So I'm turning down frequencies. I'm turning down all of these frequencies below 77 hertz now with this slope of this EQ. So I'm changing the volume of all of these frequencies here. If I come to this next knob, so we have a few different things here. We have our filter type, and we're on high pass filter, and we have our frequency, which is highs to lows. And let's just listen to this as I do it. So this is what a high pass filter sounds like as I turn it up. Right, so it's letting only the highs pass at a certain point, whatever this crossover point is here, this frequency point. Things below that are getting turned down or turned off in this case. Right. So that's my frequency. And if I wanted to make these hi-hats, if I wanted to clean up the hi-hats, I could pull this all the way up here, and you don't hear any bass drum hardly in the hi-hats at all now. If you just wanted to be cymbals and you didn't want a lot of low frequency in there, this is a very good tool. And this tool is the most used tool in live sound, because whenever you have live sound, you have all of these open instruments, all these open microphones. And these open microphones can have rumble. And this rumble can be from the PA system. The rumble can be from people stomping their feet. The rumble can be from maybe moving around a microphone stand. If you step on the bottom of the stand, it can make a rumble. It can be from other instruments on the stage. And every time that you have these rumbling things, first of all, it can cause feedback. You can get low-end feedback, actually. But apart from that, you are clouding up the bass frequencies with microphones that don't have bass information, or instruments that don't have bass information. So if you have a flute, right, you don't need all of these low frequencies in a flute. You need enough of the low frequencies to have some body in the sound, but you don't need to be down in the kick drum area with the flute. Right? Same with a voice. If you have open vocal mics on the stage and you leave all of this low-end information, you're going to get a rumble on the stage that will completely destroy the bass drum and bass guitar sound of your mix. And so this high-pass filter is a crucial filter. And if I have to go and I have to do a show, let's say that I was asked to mix a band on the fly without any preparation, I know by memory which instruments need what type of high passing. And I would just go, before I even hear the band, I know basically, I'm going to set the guitar at about 100 hertz. I'm going to set the vocals at about 160 hertz. This is just from doing it so many years. I know how to do this. But by just working with this one filter, I can almost completely clean up a mix. So it's ready to be fine EQ'd and fine detailed, right? But this one filter is crucial. And a good mixing practice is to only allow yourself two filters. So we're going to talk about the low pass filter next. And the low pass filter is exactly the opposite, right? It's over here. And it has the angle pushing the other way here. So I'm going to engage that. And you'll see that the low-pass filter cuts out high end as you move it down. So this is only allowing lows to pass. So as I change this, I'm eliminating high end. So that's my high pass filter. So apart from the frequency knobs and apart from this filter type here that we have, there's also something called the Q. And the Q is simply the slope of this angle. See this angle going down here? So right now, even though it's 100, it's set at, where's it set? 100 and, where am I? Here at 90. So if I bring this up to 100, and you look at this slope, I don't know how well you can see this on your screens, but 100 is right here. That's what this first line is here. That's 100 hertz. And that's where your frequency is set at. But look at this. You have all of this information is being taken away, even though it's above 100 hertz. So you're taking away, looks like up to about 150. And that's with this type of slope. If you start changing your slope, then you're going to change the way this reacts. So now you're not taking out as much in this area, but you're taking out a little bit more in this area. And as I change my slope, you'll see, now you're not taking out very much at 100 hertz or below 100 hertz, but you're taking out a lot more all the way up to like 250 hertz here. And that's our Q, or our slope. And what these numbers mean, so this 6 dB per octave means exactly that. So an octave in music is C to C, right? An octave in frequencies is 100 hertz to 50 hertz. So, or 100 hertz to 200 hertz, or 200 hertz to 400 hertz, or 400 hertz to 800. It's a logarithmic scale. So it doesn't work exactly as you would expect. But every doubling is an octave. So if I've got my filter set at eliminating 6 dB per octave, that means for every octave, I'm going to lose 6 dB of signal. So from 100 to 50 hertz, I've lost 6 dB of level. If I come over and I switch this to 12 dB from 100 hertz to 50 hertz, I've now lost 12 dB of signal. So that's what these numbers mean, dB per octave. Right? And it goes all the way up to 24 dB, which is a pretty steep cutoff here. So that's kind of high pass and low pass. Those are our two filters there. There's a couple other buttons here. And these buttons are notch filters. And notch filters are used if you want to totally eliminate something. So if I go here to my low filter and I turn it into a notch, boom. You can't turn it up and down. You can't change the volume of it. It's just notching out that frequency. So if I'm listening to 117 hertz and I've notched it out, then it's going to be completely gone out of the mix. And let's listen to a notch filter a little bit. These are really useful if you have a problem. If you have a problematic frequency, or for live sound, if you have feedback at a certain frequency and the room is resonating and it's ringing, you can use a notch filter to fix that. And the same here with this Q, it's the slope. So as I make the Q narrow, that's a very narrow notch filter. That's not going to get, it's only going to get this one little sliver of audio, this one little sliver of 100 hertz. But, 105 hertz or 110 hertz is going to be left alone. So it's a very narrow little sliver of audio we're cutting out. And when you go so narrow like this, you can fix a lot of problems, but you don't really hear it so much. So I'll sweep this around and you'll see that it's not as obvious. Right? Because you're cutting out such a little bit of such a narrow amount of audio, it's almost, you can't hear it almost. And if I widen it back out, you can hear it making that. It kind of sounds like that comb filter effect that we had when we combined the waveforms. And so that's our notch filter. So in last week's folder, our materials, I gave you some sheets that you should check out. I gave you some EQ cheat sheets and some compression cheat sheets and some reverb cheat sheets, I believe. And if you get a chance, read through those, and it'll kind of open your eyes as to how these devices, these plugins work. So now we go down to our main EQ section. So we have, besides these two little filters here, high pass and low pass, and our two notch filters. I'm going to just get rid of these. I'm going to hold down the option key and click on them and put them back to 0. I'll turn these off. So apart from that, from these two filters here, we have 5 bands of filtering. And there are 2 on the high and the low bands. There are 2 different selections. On the other ones, they're just the way they are. And like I said, you can think of this as a volume knob. So if we come here to this yellow one, this 1K, and we turn it up, we're actually turning up the volume at that frequency. And we have a Q here also. And so this is how narrow or wide our Q is. So that's pretty narrow, and then we can go super narrow. Comb filtery sounding. So we have 5 of these frequencies, and you can think of them, like the same as your car stereo. You got your lows, you got your mids, and you got your highs, and you can adjust to taste your different frequencies and your bandwidths, right, or your Q, and your frequency and your gain for those. So we have that for each one of these 5. On the ends, we have a special filter too, and this is a shelf filter. So our regular filter, all of these filters in the center, it's called a bell curve. And a bell curve symbol looks like this little thing here. It makes an EQ shape that is similar to a bell. Right? That's called a bell curve. Apart from that, on the high and low frequencies, we have a shelf EQ. And a shelf EQ is exactly that. You take a frequency point. So right now this is set at 131 hertz. And if you push up that frequency, it makes a shelf. And everything below that frequency point is pushed up. And you also have a Q on this, and the Q is just going to make that slope more gradual, just like it did with the high pass and low pass filters. If you go extreme with it, it actually puts a little bump and a little dip at its crossover point, at its frequency point. And these are really nice for evenly, smoothly bringing up the low end on an instrument. So if we go to our, let's go to our bass drum track. And if we take this fader and start pushing it up, so that's bringing up frequencies equally across the whole low end spectrum. And I'm going to adjust my output level so my input and output match. And then as you bypass, you'll hear how much low end we've added. So the way that I tend to work when I'm EQing any instruments, my thought process is generally what I call correctional EQing, or I'm actually lowering frequencies that are annoying as opposed to pushing up a lot of frequencies. And generally the way that I approach it, and there's a lot of different approaches for this, the way that I approach it is I might boost or cut some low end, extreme low end. You know, I generally will, if I'm going to boost, it'll be on the low end or on the high end. I generally don't do a lot of boosting in the mid-range. Right? So if I have a mid-range problem, it's usually a cut. You know, and there's a couple of different ways to look at this. If you had a bass drum track and you said, okay, I want some more low end out of that track. Well, you can just grab the fader and you can push up some low end. But maybe the problem isn't that. Maybe the problem with the kick drum track is you have too much attack. So maybe you have too much of this going on. And if you grab that and you pull it down, it makes it like you have more low end because it becomes more apparent. And so by correcting problems, by reducing the level of problems as opposed to adding levels, it's a smoother type of approach. So I'm going to briefly talk about compression. I want to do a more in-depth compression speech, like kind of a half a class on just compression, because there's so many different flavors of compression and so many different types of compressors, and they all have specialty uses and they all do different things. But I'm going to start out with our basic compressor and just show you what these things do. So the compressor we have is called the Dyne 3 compressor limiter. And this is what this guy looks like. A lot of different things you can do here. School version just has the EQ37 and the 3-band. Okay, great, thanks. All right, so here's our compressor. And if we look, we'll see that we have this same type of metering. So we want to try to do the same thing. We want to keep our input and our output at basically the same levels after we process all this stuff. So with the EQ, after you boost your EQ or after you dip your EQ, you'll adjust your levels. With this, you're going to do the same. You're going to make your corrections first, and then you're going to make sure your input and output are the same with these two meters here. So what's a compressor? A compressor is like an automatic fader, right? It's like an automatic volume fader, if you want to think of it that way. And it will take away volume of loud parts of a mix or of an instrument, sorry. So if you have an instrument and most of the volume level is at one steady place, and then it has a louder section, the compressor is going to leave the softer section alone more or less and bring down the louder section. That's what compression is. It's compressing those louder signals and it's bringing them down, you know. And so that's what we use them for, and that's how they can do so many magical things in a mix. It sounds like it's a really simple device, but man, it can make vocals smooth. It can make drums have a bite and an attack. It can make a bass guitar stick to the speakers like glue, you know, that every note is just perfectly the right level. There's so many things you can do with them for such a simple device in a way. And compression is something that you have to kind of practice hearing, I think. EQing too. EQing's a little more natural to listen for because, because the differences of frequencies are kind of easier to discern sometimes than the differences of levels, right? So this compressor, it's got a bunch of different knobs here, and we're going to start with just the threshold knob, which is this one all the way over here. So if I have an instrument, let's pick, what are we going to pick here? Let's pick something that's pretty dynamic. This piano's kind of dynamic. I don't like compression on pianos that much generally, but for our demonstration here, it'll be fine. Here we go. Dyne 3 compressor. So if I take a listen to this piano part, so if we look at our compressor, you'll see this little slider here, this little triangle. And this triangle is the same adjustment as this threshold knob. So threshold is basically where the compressor starts working at what dynamic range. So if we're looking at our peaks here on our piano, right, zoom in here, you can see that this section is much softer than this section. So if I listen to just this one little piano blip here, I can come down and I can bring my threshold down so that the compressor starts to grab those loud notes, because what I'm trying to do is I'm trying to even out my piano performance. So what I want to do is I want to grab all these loud notes and I want to bring them down a little bit. And that's basically the job of a compressor. So let's grab this guy and let's start bringing down our threshold until it starts grabbing those notes. So I'm just pulling it down. Okay, so now you see that the volume lines are going above my threshold mark. So we should start seeing some gain reduction, and that's what this last meter does here, is it shows you how much the compressor is turning down the signal. And I'll keep pulling down the threshold and you'll start to see flickers. There we go. So see how it's starting to flicker? So what I've done now is I've made that loud section, bringing it down about 4 or 5 dB, you know. So all of these louder notes are now being brought down 4 or 5 dB, and they will be more similar to the level of these notes. Well, those are high notes. So by compressing, I'm leveling out the instrument. So I'm reducing the dynamics. So apart from this threshold knob, and this is where you determine how your crossover point, or your point in which the compressor starts working. That's what the threshold does. And then you have your gain knob, so that when you turn something down, you can make it back up, like your output knob on the EQ. So if I compress the heck out of this, now you can see my input is a lot louder than my output. Now it's changing the sound a lot, but the levels are pretty much close, both inputs and outputs. So that's my gain. So that's it's called makeup gain on a lot of compressors also. And apart from that, we have this other knob over here called ratio. And this one is a little trickier to explain, but if you take a look at this line here on the display, you can see that as I change the ratio, this line flattens out. So what that means is I'm actually above any notes above my threshold point, which is what I said here, will be turned down by a ratio. So 2-to-1 means that the ratio of reduction is 2-to-1. As I turn it up to 3-to-1, I'm bringing down any of these notes that are above my threshold by a higher ratio number, 4-to-1, 5-to-1, until you get all the way up to 100-to-1. And this is, or infinity-to-1, it's called a lot of times. And infinity-to-1 means that it will not go any louder than this threshold point. So when you have your threshold set and you have it at 2-to-1, it's only reducing the information above the threshold point by a 2-to-1 ratio. If you have it set to infinity-to-1, that means that any notes are not going to get any louder than this threshold. Right? So I'll just leave the same notes, same threshold setting. I'm going to bring my ratio down. And you see there's almost no gain reduction. Right. So apart from ratio, there's another thing called the knee. And the knee is just, if you look at this same diagram here, it just smooths out how this threshold interacts. So if you have a softer knee, it's called, by turning the knee up. You see how that line kind of smooths out and becomes an arc? What that's really doing is it's starting its compression a little bit before the threshold. So if this is our threshold point, our compression is going to start right here with a hard knee compression. With a soft knee compression, well, you see that whole arc starts to change. And now we're going to start getting compression smoothly across this threshold. It's not just going to be like an on-off switch. It's smoothing out the compression point. Okay. Next, we have attack and release. And these are just how fast the compressor responds is the attack. So if let me just pull out, you don't have this compressor, but I want to show you something on another compressor. C2. So this has basically the same type of functions, but it's got this nice display here. And we have our threshold, we have our ratio, we have our attack and release. Those are the primary parts of a compressor. Down here we have our knee, and you can see it smooth out there. There's a hard knee compression. It's just a sharp angle. Boom, boom. And then a soft knee compression smooths out that little transition point. So if we take a listen to this piano, as I bring my threshold, we can see exactly how this compressor is reacting. So this compressor right now has a very fast attack. So with a fast attack, it's going to grab all of those transients and it's going to push them way down. So it's smoothing out all the transients. And you can actually see it here. If you look at the two waveforms that go by, you can see the before is the lighter one in the back, and the after. Get rid of this knee. There we go. So this sharpness down, I wonder if there's a way to hold that. No, there's not. So the sharpness down is the attack time. So if I do that same thing and I turn my attack up, what it's doing now is it's letting the attack of the transient through and then starting compressing. So it's a more natural type of sound. It's bringing down the body of the tone, but still letting the attack through. So that's by slowing down the attack. So this one knob is probably one of the most useful things on an entire compressor, because you can determine what you want to do with the compressor. And the attack has a lot to do with that. So if you have a drum hit and it's very sharp and it's got a big transient, and that transient is coming through too much in your mix, you can speed up your attack and make your attack faster, and it'll capture all those transients. The same with release. The release is how fast, once you cross the threshold, the level goes back to normal. So the attack is how fast the compressor initially reacts, and the release is how fast it goes back to normal. So if we have a quick release on a piano, you'll see that it'll just grab the little transient and then it'll jump right back. So I'm only chopping the transient there, right? If I have a slow release, you see how the whole thing just stays down softer, because the next note is attacking before the compressor's even gone and back to normal. So a slow release is for smoothing things out, because your compressor never really gets back to where it started. So that's a fast attack and a slow release. And then the opposite, a slow attack and a fast release, is normally where you want to be operating, because it's the most natural sounding of compressions. So generally when you start, put your release pretty fast and put your release fairly slow. This attack time on the compressor is telling us how much of that transient is allowed through before it actually starts compressing. So this, you can give your drums a lot of snap. You know, you can you can have the attack poke through and then a quick release, and so you're actually emphasizing the transient, right? If you have a slow attack and a fast release. If you have a fast attack and a slow release, then you're chopping that transient off. Okay, so we'll play around with those some more when I talk about compression, but this is just kind of a basis of the 4 items. Let's go back to Avid. And the reason this is called a compressor limiter is because it has a ratio that's high enough to go up to 100 to 1. And that is limiting. A limiter is just a compressor that stops the signal from going past the threshold point. All right. Apart from that, we have this other little window here, and this is trickier stuff here. This is called side chain. And what side chain does is it tells the compressor what to listen for. So if I were to side chain a compressor and I were to only allow the low notes to come through the compressor, or if I were to set my side chain so that only the low notes are passing through, this doesn't actually affect the sound. This is a side chain. This is like telling the sound how to behave. So if I were to only let low notes through, when the compressor reacts, it's only going to concentrate on compressing low frequencies. And this we'll have to get into much deeper later. It's a little tricky to explain, but I think when I bring some instruments in, but it's very useful. For example, if you have a singer and the singer has a big poke in the mid-range when they sing high and it gets harsh, you can use a side chain, and you can set up a side chain so that that compressor ignores when he's singing normal, and it only jumps in there when he's singing in this harsh frequency range. So that's kind of what a side chain does. All right. So again, we'll get into this deeper, but I just want to get you guys started with this stuff. Any questions on those? On compression and EQ? It's compression. I know it takes a while to get your head around it, and it takes a while to be able to hear it. And the best way to learn to hear compression is to kind of overdo it. So if you want to hear what an attack sounds like, put your compressor across something and crank up the threshold too much and play with the attack and release knobs, and you can see how the transients are coming through. So I'm going to turn up way too much. So now you can hear how the attack and the compressor and release are actually behaving. It's not musical. So here's a fast release and a slow attack. You hear how that compressor's clamping down? But it's letting all that transient through. If I do the opposite, it's chopping off all of that transient. And when you have a lot of threshold, what it's really doing is it's clamping down on that first transient, and then it's releasing. And because it's clamping down on this loud part of the note, the transient part, it's in essence bringing up the sustain of a note. And you hear how people say compression can add sustain, and it's really important for guitar players. That's how they get those soaring notes. Well, the reason it's doing it is because it's clamping down on the beginning, on the attack, and the compressor is taking a while to open back up. And so it's actually bringing up the soft part of those notes, So that's kind of the step one of compression. Let's see here. The next thing that we want to talk about are going to be effects, and we'll be talking about real-time effects. We'll be talking about reverbs and delays mainly first. And I think that I'm going to actually call the class a little early. I've got some personal stuff I got to take care of tonight. So we're a couple of hours in, but I think I'm going to call it early tonight, and we'll continue on next week if that's okay with you guys. All righty. Anybody have any questions for me? How's the projects going? Or anybody having any issues they need help with? No?
Well, I'm just curious. Do you ever use compression and EQ on MIDI tracks?
Well, yeah. Why not? You don't. I mean, there are MIDI compressors, but MIDI eventually ends up as audio, right? I mean, so once you put a plug-in across there, then you can compress that audio. So if I have a MIDI track here, and this is my MIDI plug-in here, I can put a compressor right after it. Absolutely. Yeah, there's no reason not to.
I had a quick question.
Yeah.
This is somewhat unrelated to exactly what we're talking about, but I wanted to just ask. I wasn't sure if I missed an email from you about a recording of last week's class. Did you send out a recording of last week's class?
Oh.
By any chance?
Maybe I didn't send out an email. I definitely think I posted it for sure. It's on my YouTube channel, but I will.
Okay, great.
I'll send out email.
Well, a follow-up to that, I was going to ask, are we going to be able to access the videos of class after the class is over?
Yeah, I'll leave them up there. Why not?
Okay, that would be great.
Yeah.
I know I'm going to be doing something in a couple months, and I'll be like, all right, I don't remember how to do this thing. Let me watch the video again.
Yeah, and when I get some time, I'll go through and I'll index some of that stuff and put some markers in there so you don't have to watch a 3-hour class to figure out what you need to hear. But absolutely, no, I want to leave that stuff up there.
That would be super helpful.
Yeah. All righty. Well, thank you very much, guys. I'll let you go, and we'll continue on with the mixing stuff next week.